now we have two cameras.
A backup just in case. Do you want to do any setting up, or should I introduce you? Are you ready to go?
Oh, well, he's going to...
You want me to read from yours too?
Well, I think we should get started. So I'll introduce Ben, and then I'll introduce Amiel, who will be reading next. So these men may not need an introduction. They may already be well known to you, or they may not. So forgive me if I'm reiterating what you already know, but it is a total joy to welcome Ben Hollander and Amiel Alcalay to Bar. Thank you for coming. Benjamin Hollander grew up between German and Hebrew before coming into English, which he now writes in, but as if still constantly translating other experiences into this new American language. Like the poet and translator Murat Mehmet Najat, Hollander imagines how the foreignness of his writing, in terms of syntax and fluency and perception, can help English grow a limb it does not have. Hollander has worked in multiple forms and genres: poetry, essays, fiction, memoir. For example, the book of Who R Was, Vigilance and Rituals of Truce, and the other Israeli. He has hosted translation conferences, edited a book called Celan Translations, Translating Tradition, called Celan in France, and written on the poetics of translating and being translated. For example, his book, Memoir American. His new book, In the House Un-American, published by Clock Group Books, is partly guided by the metaphor of translation as transport, as the perpetual crossing and metamorphosis of an immigrant's language, identity, and culture. David Shapiro has called it so America, so like an inner emigration, as if we had all changed names. In the mestizo trickster figure of Carlos Ben Carlos Rossman, a Puerto Rican Jew with roots in Leipzig in the Middle East, Hollander has brought to New York Harbor the wannabe heir to the American poet William Carlos Williams' crossbreeding with the immigrant protagonist Carl Rossman of Franz Kafka's America. Carlos's journey, as the critic Joe Safdie writes, is, quote, away from the clear and polemically American language into a more diverse, clashing and cosmopolitan vision, which can create another real world from the facts on the ground as we could know them. A political allegory emerges which unhouses the facts on the American ground by projecting them into fables in the air, where, as Charles Olson wrote, if you burn the facts long enough in yourself as crucible, you'll come to the few facts that matter, and then fact can become fable again. This translation, fact to fable, becomes a visionary landscape for Americans to learn from those who have lived in the un-American house. In the process, a text shape shifts from one form and genre to another, composed in the language of an un-American who tries to sound a native's linguistic fluency, which ends up being translated and distorted by alien frequencies. A text takes shape which is a translation from no original, since origins here, in terms of language and culture and identity, are multiple and varied and subject to translation's tendency to be a sign of betrayal and misunderstanding. Please help me in welcoming Benjamin Hollander.
Thank you, Todd. So I'm going to read from this book, In the House Un-American. Sometimes do this exercise if anybody is from New York, which is where I grew up in Queens, in Jamaica. These two little boys are my brother and I, and we're facing something. And I don't know if anybody can see it, but can anyone guess what we're facing? It happens to be the Statue of Liberty, right? And it's in 1961, but we arrived in 1958, so it took us 3 years to get off the boat. So we're looking at the Statue of Liberty, and my brother, this is almost like, from my perspective, it's two diametrically opposed perspectives, almost like what Emil Habibi called a pesoptimist perspective. where the young boy is looking there with this naive optimism, and the other one's looking at the statue and saying, it's not big enough, I'm not impressed at all. Okay. So I wrote this book. I think the genesis of this book started, I think when we were at Kelly Writer's house, pretty much. When I started thinking to myself, what would it mean to write a book in which I, as someone who came to this country at the age of 6, would write about what it meant to be not American, but to be un-American, and not even have that political consciousness of the Un-American Activities Committee in mind, but just in terms of what would it mean to be American in the sense of fighting your writing identity, your poetic identity, particularly at a time when I grew up, when we were under the sway of William Carlos Williams, okay, a lot of people. And so here's the iconic American poet, and someone like me comes along and says, I have nothing in common with this with this poet. This book, as Cole was saying, has these figures in it. Carlos Rosman, who's a Puerto Rican Jew from the Middle East, who is a wannabe William Carlos Williams, and who is kind of a cross between Williams and Carl Rosman. And Williams comes up quite a lot in the book. So I'm going to read a few pieces where he comes up. I should say that a friend of mine who I gave this manuscript to, I asked, is the manuscript clear? And he knew of this mestizo figure who was, who would be very comfortable speaking Spanglish, actually. And my friend wrote me, I asked him if it was clear and if it was, humorous. He said, "Eso es some pretty hilarious caca right there, hombre." Still, a pesar del constante cambio de language y forma, still it's constant, despite the change of language and forms, it's not only clear, but en el espíritu lúdico de Cervantes himself, in the playful spirit of Cervantes himself. So here is Carlos thinking through what it means to have William Carlos Williams as a kind of imaginary relative. And he's talking to this American about the American's father, who was a real pragmatist. Among William Williams and the Puerto Ricans, that's the other thing, when I was growing up, William Carlos Williams, there was no sense that there was a Puerto Rican in William Carlos Williams. He was the iconic American poet, and nobody even, as far as I knew, saw the Carlos in there. And I grew up in a pretty Puerto Rican neighborhood, and nobody knew this was the case. So this starts off, among William Williams and the Puerto Ricans, Carlos talked to Dennis about Dennis's father, who was a 1950s American hydraulic engineer, and needed to know that when you worked, you produced. He had no truck with a nation of counterfeiters and confidence men who waited for you to buy into a promise, speculators who had shaped one vision of the history of the Republic in what Herman had called the Wall Street spirit. He would barter if he thought what you offered him reflected the value of what he offered you. Dennis's parents ran a dry goods store, textiles and buttons and hats, which Carlos heard as a dried goods store, imagining a surplus of old raisins and apricots, sacks of flour, not knowing what this kind of store stood for in an American's Benson shop. His father, Dennis said, learned early. If there was a wheelbarrow in the yard, in the back of the store, and he could go a day without moving supplies in it, he would exchange it for an offer of a chicken, if the offer of a chicken came his way, and if, of course, he needed the eggs for his family. Would he, Carlos asked Dennis, accept a poem? Well, he didn't read much of poetry, but when he did, he could get to like it, his son told Carlos. So what if I walked in with a copy of William Carlos's Williams poem, The Red Wheelbarrow, which begins, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow? Well, the son said, it depends. If it was the poem William Carlos Williams had written, he'd take it, but not if you signed off on it. So this, I'm going to go from this piece to read from this section in the book called Facts on the Ground, where again Williams comes up. Part of this book involves, as I was saying this afternoon in Amiel when we did the practicum, taking political facts on the ground, whether they're in America or in Israel, and tweaking them a little so that the rhetoric of those facts that we've heard can be transformed through whatever story I'm telling in the imagination, so that a different reality is kind of created on the ground rather than what we know of. So this is the opening statement to that, and there's a little nod to Amiel's little history. To those whose memory may not go back to the events of 1917, a little history might help. Today, these events would be called facts on the ground. So it comes to be what we live with in the wake of what we think and talk through in the abstract. At times, these facts are anticipated. At times, they're built slowly, like Israeli settlements, over time. And usually no one notices, or more to the point, the rhetoric in the air distracts from the scene so that no one acts in time to stop them. So tension builds until the ground swells and the bodies are suddenly bloated, or as one later lyric laid bare to recall it, the mustard gas laying down the noble dead at Verdun. Enough for us to ask, as if of ghosts, where did all these dead neighbors in the world come from all of a sudden? So that we return in memory and speech across the ground where no one passed, no pasaran, since a return to civil discourse is what is wanted at this time in history. And to those whose memory may not go back to the events of 1933, here Hitler is not the issue. To the election of James Conant as head of the Harvard College, formerly Captain Conant the Younger, as he was called in 1916, and who at the time, upon meeting Fritz Haber the Elder in the city of Leipzig, one chemist to another, with much to think and talk through, listening to each other with interest as they spoke their poison gaseous inventions, with nothing but their thoughts in the air, as though they did not even have to be there in time among the facts on the ground. One later lyric laid bare to recall it, the mustard gas laying down the noble dead. And to those whose memory may not go back to the events of 1946, 1947, who may not even remember, even further back, how the progressive science of the first days of aircraft bombing had progressed just a bit too far into the humanities, who have no time to care or to distinguish who the Americans and un-Americans among us were in 1946, 1947, are maybe a bit puzzled, a bit young. Students may wonder, why am I here? Of what use is a liberal arts education in the 21st century? I have what it is an old letter from Carlos Ben Carlos Rosman, who was once given the facts straight up through his namesake, the good Dr. Carlos Williams, quote, a little history, a little Shakespeare, he said, never hurt anyone. Or, put another way, first you are liberalized, then you are professionalized. Which sounded like a plan, to be sure, to be pure, sounded a bit like electroshock therapy for the deeply studied, whose memory may not go back. The good doctor was good with advice, William Carlos Williams. Once he told Anglo the Younger, son, though there is a desire on the part of the highly organized man to breed with peasant girls, remember, if you do, we will abandon you to America, where much will be expected of you, and where you should know certain vastly important strains of men may die out due to the lack of the penetration of their highly specialized reproductive material into adequate receptors. Unless we screw each other over and over until you should be warned, the pure products of America go crazy. So the next section, is Facts on the Ground, begins with a quote from Charles Olson, who in this book becomes Carl Olson with a K. And the quote is, I think if you burn the facts long and harden yourself as crucible, this is, I think, the letter to the anthropologist, Ruth Benedict, right? I think if you burn the facts long and harden yourself as crucible, you'll come to the few facts that matter, and then fact can become fable again. And then the biographer and translator, you know, how many people know this guy, Robert Payne, translated hundreds, wrote I don't know how many biographies of people, Nazi Tongue and Hitler, and was a translator. And a very interesting statement in a book called A Report on America, which was America was fable before it became fact. So I take that idea of how do you take the facts on the ground and make them fabulous on one level and try to create a new reality. So here's a piece about Israel. Carlos comes into it, Hannah Arendt comes into it, Alexis de Tocqueville come into it. Everybody's in it. Anyway, it's called Carlos Ben Carlos Plays Badminton Upstate While Dreaming of the American Unprecedented Conditions of Equality Down Under in the so-called Jewish state. Badminton birdies, like clowns' noses, flip freely in midair over the whited bungalows in Ellenville, New York. And when they landed, Hannah turned to Carlos and remembered what Alexis had imagined at the birth of the alien republic. Hannah asked, "What happens to us under the unprecedented conditions of equality?" Carlos looked mute. So she asked again, differently, "What fables do we come to remember from the facts on the ground?" In his muteness, dust in the air and a flowering desert on his mind, Carlos remembered how one country could become fabled depending on how it used the facts of another. If it desired, Israel, the so-called Greater Judea and Samaria, could become America, or at least New York, which was the most the average Greater Judean and Samaritan knew anyway of America. I love New York. I just came back from there, just like here in Tel Aviv, but without the wars, without the fear, Guy, the teenage boy, had said, and which was the most the average Israeli wanted, like pizza. New York without the fear? He mumbled in disbelief. Before 9/11, Carlos poorly remembered, it used to be only the people upstate where the flags flew high over the porches who were afraid of coming into the big city. And he asked himself in his memory, how many New Yorkers really saw themselves as Americans back then, and how many proudly came to be un-American in order to distinguish themselves from Iowans or Texans, the way Iowans and Texans distinguish themselves from New Yorkers. The fact was, no one these days remembered this vision of New York outside America, and it was only when the fear arrived that the flags came to distinguish the island. Yeah, well, let's do the math, Carlos thought, and see if it's possible for one land, Israel, to become fabled from the facts of another, its idol, America. Carlos thought, if 10% of New Yorkers are Jews, citizens of the American Republic, and 14% of Israelis are Muslims who are citizens of the Jewish state, often in America called the 51st state, then what do these comparable numbers tell us, Carlos asked himself, about how, in becoming like America, Israel could be free, mathematically? Your analogies are lazy and imperfect, he overheard. They will never work out in the real world among the facts on the ground as we know them, which is why Carlos thought we needed to create another real world from the facts on the ground as we could know them. America, he had heard, wherever its dream migrated, was what you made of it, and he wanted to make something of it. He remembered that in 1958, when the family had first landed, his mother would ignore the crosses on the different steeples, shy away from them on their walks, or, more to the point, skulk in the shadows of their towering presence, until later that evening she bent to light a menorah privately in her home. She wanted no one to notice the lighting. But years after they landed in the mothership, during Hanukkah, Carlos reflected on his friend Hannah's different, more 21st century experience, when she witnessed the fabled menorahs in New York City pave the streets, lighting them as if with gifts of gold. They showcased the night windows of Pakistani restaurants in Midtown. They were tucked away in corner spaces among boxes of fried plantains in Chinese Cuban delis. They graced the ticket grills at Grand Central Station. They appeared over the metal detectors inside the Queens County Courthouse and across the street in the blue-tinted windows of the Colombian Bales bondsman. They knew enough not to compete with Christmas trees so much as condition individuals to the demands of a society, so Hannah once said, to make a home for 10% of the people as if they were just a given no one needed to remind anyone of. Even if their initial appearances in the non-Jewish world were just good for business or marketing relations, even if that's why they replicated and started to shine on the streets of the metropolis, so be it. In a future time, the city would look bare in winter without them. This electric, one would not even need to say religious light, present in the mass luminosity of spirit the objects reflected, objects no one even noticed were present. And that was the point. In the 21st century, no one even noticed they were present. Only the mass luminosity of the spirits they reflected. Carlos thought, it is my lonely American dream to reinvent the Jewish state from the American fact.